My father jangled his keys outside the conference room, an old tell that always meant safety. The moment the door clicked shut, my stepmother's thick file struck my cheek in a cold, calculated blow. I didn't cry. My eyes locked onto the tiny, dark lens of the smoke detector on the ceiling. The keys had jingled. The camera was rolling. Tomorrow, she will sign the final contract of her career, and it will have no escape clause. My name is Harper Vale. At 31, I am the Chief Operating Officer of Northline Realty Holdings, a company built from concrete dust and my father's sheer will. Today, we were on the 42nd floor of the Edge & Miller's Tower in downtown Grayford, closing the largest deal in our company's history. The conference room was a cage of frosted glass and muted ambition. It smelled of stale, burnt coffee from a carafe that had been sitting on the credenza since dawn, and the charcoal blue carpet absorbed sound, turning conversations into conspiracies. Outside the glass, the city was a silent, sprawling grid of opportunity and regret, its details blurred into an impressionist painting of steel and haze. My father, Graham Vale, sat at the head of the long mahogany table. His suit was impeccable, a dark navy that spoke of quiet authority, but the lines around his eyes were etched deeper than they had been a year ago. He ran a hand over his silvering hair, a gesture of fatigue he thought no one noticed. Across from me, my stepmother, Serena Vale, was a study in predatory stillness. Her white blazer was sharp enough to cut, her jewelry minimal but expensive. She was the company's public face, the polished veneer over my father's rough-hewn foundation and my own operational grit. Between us lay the document that was supposed to define our future, the master lease for the West Briar Logistics Park, a sprawling $280 million titan of a project. Our lead counsel, a man named Peters with a tie perpetually askew, gathered his papers with a sigh of relief. "Well, Graham, Serena, Harper," he said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "Everything seems to be in order. I'll just step out to give you a moment to confer before the final signatures are witnessed." He offered a deferential nod and moved toward the door. As his hand touched the chrome handle, my father's did something else. His fingers went to the cluster of keys on the table beside his leather portfolio. It was a familiar, heavy bunch, held together by a thick silver ring and a custom-made metal fob, a stylized N for Northline. He picked them up, and the keys made a distinct, metallic sound, a short, sharp jingle, chink-chink. It wasn't a nervous tick, it was a language, a warning system honed over years of living with Serena, a single, long rattle meant to be quiet, to observe. Two short, distinct jingles meant something else entirely. It meant the microphone was live, it meant the camera was recording, it meant, be careful. The walls have more than just ears now. Peters pulled the heavy glass door open and stepped into the hushed corridor. For a moment, the muffled sounds of the office, the distant ring of a phone, the low hum of voices, bled into our sterile sanctuary. Then Serena rose. She didn't walk to the door. She glided, her movements economical and precise. With a soft, definitive click, she shut the door, plunging the room back into a tense, pressurized silence. I didn't flinch. I kept my gaze steady, my hands resting calmly in my lap. The air changed, thickened. Serena's public smile, the one that charmed investors and city council members, had vanished. In its place was a flat, cold expression of absolute control. She picked up the master lease from the table. The document was nearly 2 inches thick, bound in a dark blue cover, its weight substantial. She held it not like a contract, but like a weapon. She crossed the space between us in 3 silent steps. I didn't look up at her face. Instead, I watched her reflection, distorted and monstrous, move across the polished surface of the table. Then, the world tilted in a flash of paper and pain. She swung the bound edge of the contract, all 200 pages of it, and struck me across the cheek. The impact was a dull, heavy thud, the sharp corner digging into the bone just below my eye. It didn't sting at first. It was a cold, stunning blow that smelled of high-grade paper, expensive ink, and the faint, cloying scent of Serena's jasmine perfume. "Sign it with your head down," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss that was more chilling than any shout. The file was dropped onto the table in front of me with a loud slap, splaying open to the signature page. "You will not cause a scene. You will not ask questions. You will sign this deal, secure my commission, and then you will accept your transfer to the Midwest Regional Office without a single word of protest." I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe for a full 10 seconds. The pain was beginning to bloom now, a hot, throbbing ache that radiated from my cheekbone through my jaw. But I pushed it down, compartmentalized it, filed it away under data point, my training. The years I'd spent in warehouse logistics and contract auditing took over. Emotion was a liability. Precision was survival. Slowly, I lifted my head. My gaze bypassed Serena completely, traveling upward, past the recessed lighting, to a small, unassuming white dome mounted on the ceiling tiles, the smoke detector, or rather, the high-definition, wide-angle surveillance camera disguised as a smoke detector. I had overseen its installation myself 3 months ago, part of a security upgrade for all executive-level meeting spaces. In its center was a tiny, almost invisible black lens, and just to the side of it, a pinprick of crimson light pulsed with a steady, rhythmic beat, recording, my silent, impartial witness. Serena mistook my silence for submission. A cruel, triumphant smirk touched her lips. "That's a good girl. You're learning your place. You think because your father gave you a title that you have power here? You are an operator. Harper, a cog. I am the vision. I am the one who makes the real money." She gestured to the contract. "This Westbriar deal? This is my legacy, not yours. Your vested shares are contingent on your continued employment in a senior role. That role can be in Grayford, or it can be in a damp office in Omaha cataloging expired leases. The choice is yours. Sign the paper." My heart was a cold, steady drum against my ribs. I could feel the swelling on my cheek, the metallic taste of blood on my tongue where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. Every instinct screamed at me to retaliate, to rise from my chair and shatter the icy composure she wore like armor. But I didn't. Instead, I did something far more deliberate. My chair was a high-backed leather executive model on smooth casters, with my feet flat on the floor. I pushed back slightly, the wheels making a soft whirring sound against the plastic floor mat. I didn't turn to face her. I didn't look away. I simply shifted my position, rotating the chair about 30 degrees to my left. It was a small, seemingly insignificant adjustment, a person shifting to get more comfortable, but I knew the exact focal length and angle of the camera lens above. This new position was no longer a profile shot. It was a perfect, unobstructed, 90-degree angle. It would capture my face, the fresh, red mark on my cheek, Serena standing over me, and the heavy contract lying on the table between us. It would provide irrefutable context for the violence that had just occurred. I was framing the scene for my audience of one, the hard drive tucked away in the secure server room on the ground floor. Serena's eyes narrowed, but she didn't understand the maneuver. She saw only my continued silence and interpreted it as capitulation. "Good. Now pick up the pen." Just then, the door handle turned. The click of the latch was as loud as a gunshot. The door swung open, and Peter stood there, his oblivious smile firmly in place. "Sorry to interrupt. The notary is ready for us whenever you are." The transformation was instantaneous. Serena's face softened, the hard lines melting away into a warm, professional mask. She took a step back from me, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture that, to any outsider, would look supportive, even maternal. "Of course, Peters, we were just finalizing our internal consensus. Harper was just expressing some last-minute excitement." I played my part. I let out a shaky breath I didn't feel. I looked up, meeting Peters's eyes, and forced a small, wobbly smile. I allowed my hand to tremble slightly as I reached for the pen. a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen reserved for ceremonial signings. My fingers wrapped around its cool, smooth barrel. The page was waiting. A stark white field with a single black line at the bottom. My name and title typed neatly beneath it. Serena watched me, her eyes gleaming with victory. She believed she had won. She had asserted her dominance, secured her deal, and banished me to corporate exile, all in one swift, violent motion. She saw me as a broken girl, signing away her future under duress. What she didn't see, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the contract I was about to sign was not the one she had hit me with. It was not the master lease she had spent 6 months negotiating. It was a perfect replica, a substitution I had personally printed and collated in my office at 3 a.m. the night before. The weight was the same, the font was identical, the page count was exact, but buried deep within its boilerplate, 4 clauses had been altered with the precision of a surgeon, 4 clauses that would not transfer power to her, but strip her of everything. My hand still feigning a tremor, I lowered the nib to the page. The ink, a deep, dark blue, flowed onto the paper. It felt like I was signing a death warrant, and in a way, I smiled up at my stepmother, a genuine, private smile she couldn't decipher. The keys had jingled, the camera was rolling, and the trap was now signed, sealed, and delivered to the outside world. We were the perfect brand story, a narrative polished to a high gloss for the cover of Grayford Business Monthly. The annual Vale and Family Portrait was a masterpiece of corporate mythology. There was Graham Vale, the self-made founder, his gaze steady and reassuring, a man who built an empire from forgotten industrial lots. There was Serena Vale, the elegant second wife, her smile a beacon of community engagement, the public-facing chairwoman of philanthropy. And then there was me, Harper Vale, the dutiful daughter and operational engine, always positioned slightly behind my father, a hand on his chair, the heir apparent who ensured the trains ran on time. We looked solid, a triptych of dynastic success, founder, face, and function, every year. The photographer would say, "Perfect, hold that," and for a few seconds, under the hot lights, we would almost believe it ourselves. But a brand is just a story, and our story was built on a foundation of beautiful lies. The cracks began the day Serena entered our lives, not as a stepmother but as a corporate acquisition. She came from Halverton, a city known for its old money and flashy, transient tech booms. She'd been a managing director at a boutique real estate fund, and her reputation preceded her. She specialized in deals that were, as one of her former, embittered partners once told me in a rare moment of candor, beautiful pitch, ugly math, more beautiful in form than in figures. She could package a mediocre property in such a stunning narrative of potential, with such compelling architectural renderings and a star-studded launch party, that investors would be halfway to signing before their analysts had even run the pro forma numbers. She didn't sell assets. She sold aesthetics. She was a connoisseur of the surface, a master of the glossy finish. Her world was the antithesis of mine. I grew up in the guts of Northline Realty, in the cavernous, echoing silence of half-empty warehouses on the industrial outskirts of the city. The smell of cold concrete and diesel exhaust is more nostalgic to me than any perfume. By the time I was 12, my father had taught me how to read a zoning map. By 16, I could walk a 500,000 square foot distribution center and spot structural flaws the way other girls my age could spot a designer knockoff. I knew the codes to container locks, the load-bearing capacity of reinforced concrete, and the subtle legal traps hidden in triple-net leases. Serena, on the other hand, grew up on the polished floors of fundraising galas. She knew the names of caterers, not contractors. She understood the intricate dance of social leverage, the art of placing a well-timed donation, the power of being photographed with a senator. I built the machine. She designed the packaging. This duality became the central, unspoken tension of our company. In public, Serena was a paragon. She launched the Northline Scholars Program, and every spring, A photographer from the Grayford Chronicle would capture her handing an oversized check to a tearfully grateful, underprivileged student. She was the face of our corporate social responsibility, her poise and grace a testament to the Vale family's commitment to the community. But in the private, climate-controlled corridors of our office, she was a different entity entirely. She wielded her influence like a scalpel, and her targets were almost exclusively the women on our staff. She would eviscerate a promising young analyst not for an error in her work, but for her choice of lipstick. I once overheard her telling a brilliant, highly effective project manager in the marketing department that her ideas were strong. "But that face, darling, it just doesn't project authority. It's too soft. We need power in our presentations." She never raised her voice. Her critiques were delivered in a conspiratorial whisper, which made them all the more devastating. She wasn't just a bully. She was a saboteur of confidence, systematically dismantling the self-worth of any woman she perceived as a potential threat. I tried to tell my father. I found him one evening in his study at home, the scent of old leather and his favorite single malt scotch hanging in the air. I laid it all out for him, the whispers, the resignations of talented women who left citing vague, personal reasons, the quiet terror in the eyes of the ones who stayed. He listened, staring into his glass, as if the answers were swirling in the amber liquid. When I finished, he sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from the very foundation of his soul. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Harper," he said, his voice low, "I hear you. But Serena, she holds the board in the palm of her hand. Her connections brought us the West Briar Project. Don't start a war in the house. Just keep your head down. Do your work. Let it go." That was the moment I understood. He saw it. He knew. But he had made a strategic calculation. He had chosen the path of least resistance, sacrificing his employees' well-being and my own for the sake of corporate peace and profit. He wasn't a coward, not exactly. He was a pragmatist, and in his cold, hard calculus, Serena was an asset too valuable to alienate. I was his daughter, yes, but in that room, I was also just another part of the business, a moving piece on a board he was afraid to upset. I realized then that I was utterly alone. No one was coming to save me. If this war was going to be fought, I would have to fight it myself. Serena, emboldened by my father's inaction, began her next campaign. My quiet removal. It started subtly, casual mentions of the need for stronger leadership in our Midwest regional office, praise for her nephew, a recent MBA graduate she claimed was a natural at deal-making, whom she started bringing to client meetings. She would frame it as an opportunity for me. "Harper, you've done wonders here," she'd say in executive meetings, her voice dripping with false admiration. "But your talents are wasted on day-to-day operations. A challenging market like Omaha would be a real chance for you to prove yourself as a standalone leader, to build your own team." She was painting my exile as a promotion, a gilded cage she was building just for me, far from the center of power. It was during this time that I truly began to notice the keys. My father had always been a fidgeter, but his habit took on a new, specific form whenever Serena began to weave her webs of manipulation. She would be in the middle of a sentence, her tone shifting from professional to predatory, and his hand would find the heavy cluster of keys on the table. A long, slow, rattling jingle would fill the momentary silence. At first, I thought it was just a sign of his discomfort, a physical manifestation of the anxiety he wouldn't voice. He was a man who hated conflict, and the keys were the sound of his retreat. But I'm an operator. I see patterns. It's what I do. I audit lease agreements for discrepancies. I analyze supply chains for inefficiencies. I started cataloging the jingles in my mind. A long, drawn-out rattle happened when Serena was dressing down an employee in his presence, a signal of his helpless frustration. A series of short, agitated clicks occurred when she was overstating her role in a successful deal to the board, the sound of his teeth grinding, outsourced to a piece of metal. It was his tell, the unconscious rhythm of his conscience. The language evolved about a year ago. We were in a tense negotiation with a zoning commissioner. Serena was charming him, promising community investments we hadn't budgeted for, essentially committing the company to millions in unplanned spending. My father was silent, but his keys on the conference table sounded two short, sharp notes. Chink, chink. It was crisp, deliberate. It was different from the nervous rattles. It was a signal. My eyes met his for a fraction of a second, and I understood. It meant, record this, remember this. It was the birth of our secret language. He couldn't speak out against her, but he could arm me. He could give me the data I needed. From that day on, I learned to listen to the metal. A long, slow jingle still meant, be silent, observe, endure. It was the sound of his truce, but two short, sharp jingles became our call to arms. It meant the tape is rolling. He had upgraded the security in the conference rooms, at my suggestion, and he was using it. He was building an archive, the same way I was. He was fighting a quiet, guerrilla war from behind enemy lines, and the jingle of his keys was the only communication we could share. He was not my savior, but he had, in his own way, become my accomplice. He gave me the weapon, knowing, trusting, that I would be the one with the courage to eventually pull the trigger. My father built the house. Serena decorated it, but I was the one who checked the foundations. As chief operating officer, my domain was the unglamorous, load-bearing architecture of the company, the systems, the processes, and, most importantly, the contracts. I didn't just read leases, I dissected them. I lived in the fine print, the clauses that existed in the shadows between the numbered lines. My world was one of precise, unforgiving language. My days were spent navigating the complex contractual traps that separated a 9-figure profit from a 9-figure catastrophic loss. I loved the cold, brutal logic of a go-dark provision. It was a tenant's ultimate betrayal, a clause allowing a major anchor store like a supermarket or a department store to simply cease operations, stop business, lock the doors, while still paying rent. It saved them payroll, but it killed the foot traffic for the entire shopping center, bleeding our smaller tenants dry. A co-tenancy agreement was a house of cards. It stipulated that if the anchor tenant left, or went dark, all the smaller tenants would either receive massive rent reductions or be given the right to terminate their own leases. It was a domino effect encoded in legal boilerplate. Radius restrictions were fences, preventing us from leasing property within a 3-mile radius to a tenant's competitor. My job was to ensure that if one card fell, our entire structure didn't collapse. I was the operator, the systems analyst, the company's chief cartographer for a landscape of legal minefields. And Serena hated it. She hated my questions, my red lines, my insistence on modeling worst-case scenarios. She sold the dream. I managed the reality. The West Briar Logistics Park project, Serena's $280 million monument to her own genius, landed on my desk 6 months ago. It was heavy, complex, and, according to her, fast-tracked. That was my first red flag, in my world. Fast-tracked is just corporate speak for don't look too closely. So, naturally, I looked closer than I ever had before. I spent my nights in the office, the silent hum of the HVAC system, my only companion. The glow of my triple monitors was the only light, reflecting off the glass walls as I traced the lineage of every document, every email chain, every metadata log. The anomaly appeared on a Tuesday at 2:17 a.m. It wasn't in the primary lease agreement. She was too smart for that. It was buried in a seemingly innocuous addendum. Appendix 17B. Special vendor and community provisions. Tucked between the line item for recycled water reclamation systems and the landscaping budget for native plants was a single, cryptic entry. Kickback consulting services. It stipulated a fee, payable by Northline, to a third-party LLC for project facilitation and key stakeholder advisory services. The name of the LLC was Aldercrest Advisory. It sounded official, sterile, and completely anonymous. I ran it through the state database. It was a shell corporation, A ghost entity registered just 8 months prior, standard procedure for hiding assets. But the registered agent, that was the mistake. It wasn't Serena. She was too insulated for that. It was her personal assistant, a young, ambitious woman named Chloe Anders, who owed her entire career, her apartment, her car, everything, to Serena. It was a firewall, but a flimsy, flammable one. When Chloe's name populated on my screen, there was no jolt of surprise, just a cold, heavy certainty. It was the click of a heavy tumbler falling into place. My rage was cold and precise. It didn't burn, it focused. I pivoted to our internal accounting system. I searched for Aldercrest. Nothing. I tried advisory. Nothing. Serena had routed the payments through a discretionary community engagement budget she alone controlled. A black box I had never been given access to, but I didn't need to see the payment. I just needed to prove the connection. I cross-referenced the vendor ID from the draft appendix with other active projects. Bingo, payments had already been made, authorized by Serena's unique executive code, for consulting on 3 smaller retail leases we'd signed in the last quarter. The fee was always the same percentage, exactly 2% of the total lease value. A 2% connection fee, paid by our company to our chairwoman of philanthropy's personal assistant, for deals Serena was already being paid a 7-figure salary to close. It was a parasitic, perfectly hidden siphoning system, and naturally, it had never been disclosed to the audit committee or the board of directors. This became my real work. My official duties were a performance. My true job began at 8 p.m. When the building emptied, I opened a new, encrypted drive, firewalled from the company network, and began to build my case, not as a wounded daughter, but as a federal prosecutor. I created a relationship map, a spider's web of connections. Serena at the center, lines radiating out to Chloe, to Aldercrest, to the specific branch of Freeport Bank that held the LLC's account. I tagged every email where Serena pushed the Aldercrest provision. I highlighted every message where she dismissed my requests for vendor due diligence, calling them delaying tactics. I ran an IP trace on the original metadata of the Appendix 17B file. It hadn't been created on a company computer. It had been uploaded from a residential IP address in Halverton, Serena's private home address. My spreadsheet grew into a sprawling indictment, with columns for date, time, action, and statute violated. This wasn't just data entry. It was the meticulous construction of a cage. Now that I had the what, I needed to control the how. I needed to tie the digital crime to the physical evidence. The contract itself became my weapon. I took the original Westbriar lease file, the one Serena thought was the final version, and began my own edits. This is where my operational control was absolute. I embedded a digital watermark, invisible to the naked eye and undetectable by standard software. It was a string of microdots in the header of every page, forming a simple alphanumeric code, KV031. It wasn't random. It was the date of the meeting, 3 months prior, where my father, listening to Serena's first pitch for the Westbriar deal, had leaned forward and his cluster of keys had struck the table. Chink chink, 2 sharp, clear sounds. The day the recording began, KV031. It was my secret signature, my timestamp of betrayal, burned into the DNA of the very document she would use to try and destroy me. I created multiple versions of this watermarked file, and then I laid the bait. I saved a copy on our internal share drive in a deeply nested, obscure folder. I named the folder Archive Z, Do Not Open. It was the digital equivalent of a bright red button, a piece of cheese in a trap. I knew Serena's assistant monitored my file activity. Serena was paranoid about what I knew. I needed them to find it. I needed them to think they had stolen my real version, to believe they were one step ahead. Meanwhile, the true version, the substitution, the one with my surgical alterations, I kept on a sandboxed, air-gapped laptop in my office safe. The final step was to document her intent, to prove she wasn't just negligent, but actively malicious. I used the one thing she hated most, Procedure. I instituted a new executive signing protocol, citing new SEC compliance and audit requirements for deals over $50 million. A two-man rule. All final lease agreements required a sign-off from both me, as COO, and the head of our legal department before going to the CEO for signature. It was a reasonable, defensible, and entirely necessary corporate control. And I knew she would never ever follow it. I presented the new protocol at a quarterly operations review, with the entire executive team present. Serena's smile was thin, a slash of red lipstick. "Harper, that's incredibly inefficient," she said, her voice smooth and patronizing. "We are closing the deal of a lifetime, and you want to slow us down with paperwork?" "It's for compliance, Serena," I replied, keeping my own voice flat, devoid of emotion. "To protect the board, to protect Father." "The board trusts me to protect them," she countered, and the meeting moved on. The next day, the notification hit my inbox. She had gone into the contract management system to finalize the Westbriar lease for the upcoming signing event. My two-man rule had flagged it, requiring my legal and operational approval, and right on schedule. A second notification appeared. Executive Override, S. Vale. She had used her executive privilege, a feature in the system I had helped design for genuine emergencies. As a blunt instrument, she overrode my legal review flag. She overrode the compliance check. She overrode the vendor verification for Aldercrest Advisory. I smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't reach my eyes. I logged into the system admin panel and pulled the immutable audit log. Each override was time-stamped, user-stamped, S. Vale, and logged with her office IP address. Each click was another digital footprint in the wet cement. She wasn't just breaking the rules. She was actively, willfully, and arrogantly dismantling the very safeguards designed to protect the company, all to push through her fraudulent deal. I printed the override notification. I highlighted the timestamp. I placed it in a physical binder marked Westbriar Due Diligence. The binder was already 4 inches thick. She wasn't just nailing the coffin shut. She was signing her name to every single nail. The document Serena had used to strike me was a weapon. But it was a clumsy, brutal thing. The one I was about to give her was a scalpel. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. Forged in the late-night silence of my office, I called it the substitution rider. To the untrained eye, to Serena's eye, which saw only victory and dollar signs, it was identical to the master lease she had so aggressively championed. It had the same title page, the same table of contents, the same heft and feel. The page numbers aligned perfectly. The margins were exact to the millimeter. The font was the same corporate-mandated Times New Roman, size 12. But my version had a different soul. It was a Trojan horse constructed of paper and ink, and I had replaced 4 critical lines of its legal code with 4 switches, each designed to detonate a different part of her world. The first switch was buried on page 87, under the section heading Representations and Warranties of the Parties. Her version contained standard language about corporate authority. My version, in section 22.4c, was titled Anti-Kickback Representation and Personal Liability Covenant. It was a legal bear trap, laid in plain sight. The language was dense, but its function was brutally simple. It required the signatory for the company, in this case, my father as CEO and Serena as chairwoman, who would co-sign at the press event, to personally attest, under penalty of perjury, that no undisclosed third-party fees, commissions, or consulting payments had been made in connection with the deal. It specifically named any entity controlled by or affiliated with an officer of the company. It was the Aldercrest Advisory Clause. And then came the teeth. The covenant stipulated that if this representation was found to be false, it would constitute a material breach of contract and, more importantly, a violation of the signatory's fiduciary duty. The penalty wasn't a fine. It was the immediate, non-negotiable termination of their employment contract for cause, and the forfeiture of all vested and unvested stock options. By signing the page, Serena would not be closing her deal. She would be personally certifying her own fraud and signing her own letter of termination. The second switch was more personal. I inserted it into the key person provision on page 112. Key person clauses are common. They tie the validity of a contract to the continued involvement of specific individuals. Serena had insisted on being named a key person alongside my father, a vanity play to cement her importance. I left her name in place, but I added a new subclause, a key person morals clause. It was a tripwire. It stated that if any individual designated as a key person was found, through verifiable evidence, to have engaged in an act of physical violence or intimidation against another employee on company property, Northline Holdings would immediately lose its exclusive option to purchase the Westbriar property at the end of the lease term. The $280 million project would remain a lease, but the lucrative back-end ownership, the part of the deal that generated true generational wealth, would vanish. It was a poison pill of my own design. The video clip from the conference room, my silent witness, was the verifiable evidence. Her signature would be the act that armed the bomb. The video would be the detonator. The third switch was purely mechanical, a piece of financial engineering I was particularly proud of. It was located in the escrow and funding schedule. Serena's version directed the initial $10 million escrow deposit into a third-party fund managed by a subsidiary of Halverton Trust Bank, a bank where she had deep personal connections and, I suspected, favorable terms that benefited her personally. My version added a new condition precedent, an escrow trigger. It was a simple, elegant mechanism. It stated that in the event of a material breach of the morals clause, evidenced by time-stamped digital recording, the escrow agent was immediately instructed, by the power of the contract itself, to bypass the Halverton Fund and wire the entire $10 million deposit directly back to a designated Northline Holdings corporate treasury account. It was a kill switch. With a single email containing a single video file, I could claw back every penny before she even knew what was happening, cutting off her access to the capital that was the lifeblood of her power. The final switch, the fourth and perhaps most devastating, was not about punishment. It was about exposure. It was a single sentence added to the governance and oversight section. I called it the audit call option. It granted the independent members of the Northline Board of Directors the right, upon a simple majority vote, to trigger an immediate, unrestricted, and independent forensic audit of any and all projects, budgets, and special purpose entities associated with any signatory of the agreement. The key phrase was, within 24 hours. It bypassed the usual corporate red tape, the weeks of notice, the scheduling committees. It was an emergency override for the truth. It was the key that would unlock every door she had ever sealed, every black box budget she had ever created, and expose the entire Aldercrest advisory scheme to the cleansing fire of a forensic accounting team that had no loyalty to her. It was a corporate colonoscopy, and her signature was the consent form. I labored over the document for 2 nights, fueled by black coffee and a cold, clarifying rage. I used the same industrial-grade printer in the central copy room that our legal department used. I used the same high-grade, 24-pound bond paper. I even calibrated the printer settings to ensure the ink saturation and toner levels were identical to the original. I held both versions, hers and mine, up to the light, side by side. They were perfect twins. No one could tell the difference. No one except the scanner that could read the invisible watermark. My silent signature, KV031, glowing in the header. The moment came the afternoon before the signing. Serena summoned me to her office. It was a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city, all white leather and polished chrome. She was on the phone, laughing, a sound like ice cubes rattling in an empty glass. She waved a dismissive hand, indicating I should sit. When she finally hung up, she didn't look at me. She was looking at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. "The press conference is tomorrow at 10, she said, her voice flat. "The media packets are ready. I need a final, clean copy of the master lease for the signing table. Not one of these bulky legal binders. A compact, presentation-style copy, unbound, Have it on my desk by morning. No excuses. I felt a stillness descend over me, a profound and absolute calm. It was the most beautiful sentence she had ever spoken to me. She was so blinded by her impending triumph, so certain of my defeat, that she had just personally requested the very weapon I had designed for her execution. She wanted a compact version, easy to handle for the cameras, which meant she wouldn't be flipping through its 200 pages, comparing it to her own draft. She was handing me the victory. "Of course, Serena," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I'll have it ready." That evening, just before the building's cleaning crews arrived, I went to my father's office. He was sitting in the dark, staring out at the city lights. He looked tired, defeated. I placed the slim, unbound stack of pages, my substitution rider, on the corner of his large oak desk. I didn't say a word. He looked at the document, then at me. He reached out and pulled it closer. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading contracts. He didn't need to read every word. His hands understood the language of these documents as well as his eyes. He fanned the pages with his thumb, feeling their weight, their texture. He stopped at a random page in the middle, his eyes scanning the dense text. He wouldn't see the new words, not with a cursory glance, but he could feel it. A musician can feel when a single string on his instrument is out of tune. A builder can feel when a foundation is off by a single degree. My father could feel that this document, this thing that looked and felt so familiar, was fundamentally different. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. There was a question there, 100 questions. What have you done? But he didn't ask. He had seen the bruise on my cheek that I had tried to cover with makeup. He had heard the silence that had replaced my arguments in our meetings. He had seen me retreat, regroup, and work in the shadows. He didn't know the specifics of my plan, but he knew a counteroffensive when he saw one. His hand went, by instinct, to the set of keys on his desk. His fingers brushed against the cool, familiar metal of the Northline fob. For a long, heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going to pick them up. I thought I would hear the rattle of warning, of disapproval, of retreat, the sound of his surrender. But his hand fell away. The keys lay there, silent and inert, immobile. He looked from the contract back to my face, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. There were no words. There didn't need to be. The jingle had been a call to arm me. The silence was his permission to fire. I finally knew he understood. And in his silence, I knew which side he was on. He was on the side of the truth. He was on my side. The building was a hollowed-out skeleton after dark. My footsteps echoed in the marble lobby, a solitary sound in a space usually bustling with the noise of ambition. The security guard at the main desk, a man named Arthur whose nightly companion was a dog-eared paperback, simply nodded as I swiped my access card. For the COO. Being in the office at all hours was normal. It was my natural habitat. The elevator ascended in a silent, gliding rush. When the doors opened onto the 42nd floor, I was met with an unnerving stillness. The open-plan office, a sea of dark monitors and empty chairs, was a ghost of its daytime self. I walked the familiar path to my office, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of my heels. The only light was the cold, blue-white glow of the emergency exit signs and the faint, star-like twinkle of the city grid outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I didn't turn on the overheads. I closed my office door, the latch clicking into place with a sound that felt deafeningly loud. The time on my monitor read 23:40, 11:40 p.m., the witching hour for deals and betrayals. I switched on the small, brass lamp on my desk, and a warm, focused cone of light pushed back the darkness, illuminating a small circle of my world. My keyboard, a legal pad, and a single, plain white shirt, freshly pressed and hanging from the back of my chair. In the sudden quiet, the sound of the building's HVAC system became a living presence. It wasn't just a hum. It was a slow, rhythmic, low-frequency pulse. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a giant, mechanical heart, pumping conditioned air through the arteries of the tower. It was the only heartbeat in the room besides my own, and mine was just as steady, just as cold. From my desk drawer, I removed a small, velvet-lined box. Inside, nestled in the black fabric, was a piece of technology no larger than a shirt button. It was a high-resolution microcamera, its lens a tiny obsidian fleck. I picked it up. It felt cool and dense in my palm. This was my first mirror, the impartial eye that would reflect the truth back at a world determined to ignore it. I carefully threaded its pin-sized backing through the placket of the white shirt, positioning it as the second button from the top. It was perfect, indistinguishable. I put the shirt on, standing in front of the dark window, using my faint reflection. I angled the desk lamp to test the feed on my phone. The image was crisp. I adjusted the lamp's dimmer, watching the light meter on the app. I needed to keep the ambient light in the conference hall tomorrow below 10 lux, any brighter, and the camera's sensor could be overwhelmed, creating a lens flare that might obscure a crucial micro-expression on Serena's face. Everything had to be perfect. Every detail was a variable in a complex equation, and the sum had to be absolute ruin. Next, I turned to my computer. For the past 6 months, my evidence. The video files from the conference room camera, the IP logs, the financial traces, the system override reports, had lived on a triple encrypted partition of Northline's internal cloud server. It was secure, but it was still on their turf. It was time to bring my soldiers home. I initiated a transfer protocol, routing the data through a series of anonymous VPNs before downloading the entire multi-gigabyte package. The progress bar crawled across the screen, a slow green line of liberation. Once the transfer was complete, I executed a series of military-grade file deletion commands, wiping the cloud partition 7 times over, leaving nothing behind but digital ghosts and scrambled bits. The data now resided on a single, solid-state external hard drive, no bigger than a credit card. I took the drive, walked over to the large, framed architectural rendering of our first warehouse, and swung it open. Behind it was a fireproof safe, set flush into the wall. I placed the drive inside, next to a sealed copy of my last will and testament. I closed the heavy steel door and spun the combination lock. The archive was now off the grid. It existed only in the physical world, protected by fire and steel. My phone buzzed, a preset alarm, midnight. It was time for the next call. I looked up the number from a handwritten note I kept in my wallet. It was a private line, one that didn't go through a switchboard. It rang twice. Finch, a dry, no-nonsense voice answered. Alistair, it's Harper Vale. I was wondering if you were going to call, he said. Alistair Finch was a senior partner at Cedar Line Forensics, the most ruthless and respected independent auditing firm in the country. He was a shark who smelled blood in balance sheets. I had put him on a preliminary retainer 2 months ago under the guise of proactive compliance consulting. The forecast is changing, I said, speaking in the coded language we had agreed upon. There's a high probability of a significant weather event tomorrow morning. I see, he said. There was a pause, the sound of a pen tapping on a desk. And what's the trigger for deploying our response team? The trigger phrase is keys ringing. If you receive an email from me with that exact subject line, and only that subject line, you are authorized to act on the pre-approved engagement letter. That means you contact the chairman of the audit committee directly and inform him that a full, unrestricted forensic audit has been invoked as per the contract I forwarded you. Understood. We are ready to move on your signal. Good luck, Ms. Vale. The line went dead. That was the second mirror. The external, official entity that would hold up the reflection of her crimes for the board to see. With that done, I leaned back in my chair and did the one thing I had been avoiding. I opened the video file from that afternoon. The footage filled my screen. There was the conference room, the frosted glass, the charcoal carpet. The sound was crystal clear. I heard the door click shut. I watched Serena's face harden, her movements precise and predatory. I saw the bound contract swing through the air, and I heard the sickening, dull thud as it connected with my cheek. It was worse on screen, colder, more brutal, but I wasn't watching as a victim. I was watching as a prosecutor. The angle was perfect. My 90-degree turn had framed the shot exactly as I'd planned. Her face, my face, the weapon, all in crisp 4K resolution. I watched my own reaction, the stillness, the slow turn of my head toward the ceiling camera. Then, her voice, a low, venomous whisper, perfectly captured by the overhead microphone. "Sign it with your head down." I checked the timestamp in the corner of the frame. Tino 3:17. It was my smoking gun. But violence was only half the story. I needed to chain the physical act to the financial crime. I accessed the final data I had pulled from our accounting software, the complete 18-month payment history for Aldercrest Advisory. I printed it, the pages spooling out of my desk printer with a soft whir. Most of the payments were domestic wire transfers to the main Freeport bank account, but 4 were different, 4 larger payments, corresponding to our 4 most profitable new leases, had been routed differently. They went to a numbered account at Freeport Bank's offshore branch in the Cayman Islands. An anonymous, untraceable account. It was the final link. She wasn't just stealing from the company. She was laundering the money, hiding it from the IRS, from the board, from everyone. She was a thief on a grand scale. This document was the proof. I folded the printout and placed it in my blazer pocket. I looked at the clock. 1:30 a.m. It was time to light the fuse. I picked up my personal phone and composed a new text message. The recipient was Marcus Thorne, the 75-year-old, deeply honorable, and famously cantankerous chairman of Northline's audit committee. He was an old friend of my father's, a man from a generation that believed a handshake was a contract and integrity was a company's most valuable asset. My message was brief. "Marcus, hope you're well. A piece of friendly advice. Don't eat breakfast tomorrow morning. You'll be full on news. Harper." I hit send. The message was delivered. A few seconds later, 3 dots appeared, then vanished. He wouldn't reply, but he would be waiting. He would be watching. My final task was the most mundane. I took a small, black burner phone from my safe, fully charged, and set to silent. I wrapped it in a small plastic bag. Then I walked out into the main office, to the reception area that would be used for the press conference tomorrow. The podium was already in place, the Northline banner hanging behind it. To the side of the podium was a large ceramic pot containing a tall and healthy snake plant, its waxy, striped leaves reaching for the ceiling. It was the kind of bland, corporate greenery that was designed to be ignored. I reached deep into the pot, my fingers pushing aside the dry soil and decorative moss. I buried the phone, leaving just the very top edge exposed, the camera lens peeking out between 2 leaves, aimed directly at the podium. My redundant system, my insurance policy, my third and final mirror, hidden in the dirt, waiting to reflect the final act. I returned to my office, turned off the lamp, and looked out the window. The city was quieter now, its lights a glittering tapestry woven against the black velvet of the night. Down there, people were sleeping, dreaming, oblivious. They didn't know that in this tower, a war was about to be won, not with a bang, but with a signature, a video clip, and a set of keys that had finally fallen silent. I stood in the silence of the 42nd floor. The burner phone settled deep in the soil of the snake plant, a cold, sleeping sentinel. My gaze drifted to my father's empty corner office, dark and quiet at this hour. Graham Vale, the founder, the patriarch, the man whose name was etched onto the glass doors of the lobby. For the last year, he had been the central, agonizing question of my life. Was he my ally, or was he her chief accomplice? A prisoner, or the man who had willingly handed her the keys to the prison? My mind drifted back, as it so often did, to his old office, the one in our first building, a renovated brick warehouse that smelled of sawdust and ambition. I couldn't have been more than 12, perched on a stool, my legs dangling, while he unrolled a set of blueprints that covered his entire desk. He unrolled a lease agreement on top of it, a document that looked to me like an unreadable sea of text. "You want to learn this business, Harper?" he had asked, his voice rough but kind. I'd nodded. He tapped the first page with a thick, calloused finger. Everyone starts on page 1. They see the big, pretty rendering of the building. They see the rental rate, and they think they understand the deal. They are wrong, always. He flipped past the cover, past the table of contents, to a section deep within the document. "You always start here," he said, tapping section 1. "Definitions. Don't you ever sign anything until you know what every single word means. Premises. Common area. Force majeure. This is the part they don't want you to read. The cover page is the story they want you to buy. The definitions are the truth. The truth is the only part that matters." He was a man who believed in foundations. He taught me that a building was only as strong as its footings, and a contract was only as strong as its definitions. Then how? The question echoed in my mind, a cold ricochet of doubt. How could the man who taught me to find the truth now be living so comfortably with the lie? For the past 18 months, I had watched that man, my mentor, my father, recede. He had become a ghost in his own company, a silent observer at his own executive table. I watched him stand by, his jaw set, while Serena systematically dismantled projects I had spent years building. I'd presented a detailed operational analysis for the Midwest portfolio, and she had dismissed it as too granular, waving her hand and saying, "The big picture, Harper, that's what matters." My father, the most granular man I knew, had said nothing. He just stared at the North Line N on his notepad, tracing its outline over and over. He had let her push me. When she first floated the idea of my transfer to Omaha, framing it as a leadership opportunity, he had avoided my gaze for a solid week. He'd let her humiliate me in front of the board, let her cut my authority, let her paint me as a competent but uninspired operations girl, while she, the visionary, secured the future. His silence was her permission. His passivity was her power. He was an accomplice in his own erasure, and mine. The doubt had hardened into a cold, bitter certainty. He had chosen her, the polished, profitable lie, over me, the difficult, expensive truth. And yet, there was the paradox, the keys, the signals, the secret language of a prisoner. The memory of the parking garage was still so sharp it felt like it had happened an hour ago. Not 3 weeks. It was late, raining. The concrete garage was damp, smelling of cold exhaust and ozone. I was walking to my car, my heels clicking in the oppressive silence. When I saw him, he wasn't in his usual spot. He was leaning against a concrete support pillar near my car, a solitary figure under a single, flickering fluorescent light. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the harsh light carving deep shadows under his eyes. I stopped. My hand tightened on my briefcase. "Serena is agitated," he said, his voice flat, uninflected. It wasn't a warning, it was a weather report. "She's agitated because I asked for the vendor verification on the Aldercrest account," I said, my voice just as cold. "She doesn't like it when people read the definitions." His eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of the man from the old office, a spark of pride, quickly extinguished by fear. He looked up, past me, toward the elevator bank where a small, red camera light was visible. He knew we were being watched. Serena had her assistant, Chloe, monitor the security feeds of the executive garage. He knew. He reached into his pocket. I tensed, expecting a lecture, a plea to stand down. Instead, his hand emerged with the heavy keyring. He didn't look at it, he just held it, and with a small, deliberate flick of his wrist, he made the keys talk. Chink chink, 2 sharp, distinct jingles. The signal, the tape is rolling. Be careful, I am here. It was the signal of an ally, not an accomplice. A long, heavy sigh escaped him, a sound that seemed to part the damp air. "Harper," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Don't do anything that will break this house. Please, it's all we have." The plea ignited a fuse in me, the anger I had suppressed for a year. The white-hot rage of betrayal and disappointment came to the surface. "Break this house?" I whispered back, stepping closer to him, into his space. "You think I'm the one breaking it? She's been selling it for parts for years. This house was sold for 2% a long time ago. Dad." I had never spoken to him like that. I expected him to be furious, to defend her, to finally decisively choose her side. Instead, his face crumpled. The fear and exhaustion were replaced by a profound, agonizing grief. He knew. He had known all along. He just hadn't known how to fight her. She had woven herself so deeply into the fabric of his life and the company that he believed trying to remove her would unravel everything he had ever built. He reached into his other pocket, the one he rarely used. He pulled out a different keychain. It was small, just 2 keys on a simple ring. He fumbled with one, a simple, old-fashioned brass key, and unhooked it from the ring. He didn't hand it to me. He pressed it into my palm. His hand was rough, calloused, the builder's hand that had taught me how to read blueprints. My hand, the operator's hand, was smooth. "What's this?" I asked. "It's not a key," he said. He closed my fingers around it. It was warm from his body. "It's a definition." I looked down. It wasn't a key. It was a USB drive, cleverly milled to look like an antique house key. He looked around the garage one more time, his eyes empty. "A long time ago, I started to suspect. I hired an outside firm to look into her Halverton partners before we were married." He had his own archive. "I shut it down," he said, his voice hollow. "I shut it down because I was a coward, because I wanted to believe the cover story. I put this in a drawer and I tried to forget." He looked at me, his eyes now clear and hard. "I taught you to read the truth. Harper, I never thought I'd be too weak to do it myself." "You're not weak." I drove home that night, the small metal key a cold weight in my pocket. I plugged it into my personal laptop, the air-gapped one. There was one folder. It was old. The emails were from 7 years ago, before the marriage, when Serena was still just a high-priced consultant, advising Northline on its expansion. They were between her and a former partner at her old Halverton fund. I read them, and the blood drained from my face. She wasn't just an opportunist, she was a predator. "He's a builder, not a player." One of her emails read, "He's so proud of his concrete and steel. He doesn't even see the value is in the paper. He's letting me restructure the entire holdings company. He thinks I'm adding value. I'm building a cage." And another, "My fee is just the start. He's already talking about a permanent role. He's given me a key to the house, but I'm going to own it. I've already established my own private share through an offshore entity, a safety net. Darling, a builder needs a foundation. A queen needs an escape route." It was all there. The intent, the long con, the blueprint for the theft of his entire life's work. He had this, all this time, and he had buried it. The memory of the garage, the final moment, came back to me. As I was getting into my car, the small USB heavy in my hand, I had turned back to him. "Dad," I said, the word feeling strange on my tongue. "After all this, with everything that's about to happen, whose side are you on?" He didn't hesitate. He stood up straight, and for a moment, the old founder was back, the man who built an empire from dust. "I've always been on the side of the truth. Harper," he said, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the damp air. "And that has always meant I am on your side." I stood in my dark office, the memory fading. The question was answered. He wasn't an accomplice. He was my first ally. He was the one who had taught me the language of the enemy. And when he was too broken to fight himself, he had passed the weapon to me. He had given me the signal to record, and then he had given me the one piece of evidence I never could have found myself. The definition of her soul. The house was about to break, but he and I, we were on the same side, and we were going to be the only ones left standing when the walls came down. The 38th floor atrium was not a room. It was a stage. It had been designed for moments precisely like this, a cavern of glass and steel that overlooked the Grayford skyline, built to make men and women feel like titans. Today, it was a theater of corporate propaganda, and the play was Serena's Victory. The air was already hot, thick with the dry metallic heat of portable television lights that made a mockery of the building's sophisticated climate control. The background hum of the crowd, a mix of journalists, board members, and fawning city officials, was a low-frequency vibration I felt in my teeth. A massive vinyl backdrop, stretched taut behind a long mahogany table, provided the set dressing. West Briar Logistics Park, a new era. The North Line N was everywhere, a gleaming silver icon. An era was indeed dawning, just not the one Serena had planned. I spotted the sharks in the water, reporters I knew by name, a columnist from the Grayford Chronicle, whose pen could be either a scalpel or a love letter, depending on who was buying him lunch, a sharp-eyed producer from a national financial news channel, her microphone cube a bright red symbol of consequence. They were all here, drawn by the scent of a $280 million deal. They were here for the story of the perfect Vale and family brand. And then she made her entrance, Serena Vale, in a white, razor-sharp pantsuit. It was an audacious choice, a declaration of purity and triumph, the armor of a modern-day Joan of Arc. If Joan had been funded by offshore accounts, she moved through the room not as an employee, but as a monarch. Her smile was a high-wattage, low-warmth beam that she bestowed upon the crowd. In her hand, she carried nothing but a single, outrageously expensive pen. It looked like a Montlock, a gleaming black and platinum torpedo. She was so confident, she didn't even need a briefcase. She was here for one purpose: to sign, to smile, and to ascend. I stood in my designated spot, just behind the podium, slightly to the left. It was the COO's position, supportive, essential, but out of the direct spotlight. My dark gray suit was a deliberate contrast to her angelic white. I was the shadows, the functional, unglamorous mechanism that made her brilliance possible. My hand rested, seemingly casually, on the rim of the large ceramic pot holding the snake plant. The soil was cool and dry. I could feel the hard, rectangular outline of the burner phone just beneath the surface. My button camera, my first mirror, was live, its tiny lens capturing a wide shot of the proceedings. The hidden phone, my second mirror, was aimed directly at the signature line on the table. Redundancy was the heart of all good operations. My father, Graham Vale, was already at the table, looking statesmanlike but drawn. He nodded to Serena, a stiff, public acknowledgement. Serena took her seat at the center, placing her magnificent pen on the table with a quiet, proprietary click. She was ready. "Harper, darling," she called, her voice bright and carrying. "The final signatory pages. If you please, let's not keep our friends in the press waiting." This was the moment, the pivot, the fulcrum on which the entire future of the company would turn. I picked up the stack of papers from the credenza. It was my substitution rider, the Unbound. Presentation-style copy she had requested, 200 pages of pristine white paper, outwardly identical to her fraudulent contract, but bearing my 4 hidden switches, and of course, the invisible watermark, KV031. I walked toward her. The camera shutters, which had been a sporadic click-clack, suddenly erupted into a feeding frenzy, a sound like 100 insects chattering. The flashes were blinding. I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a canyon, the wind of public scrutiny trying to tear me from my path. Every step was measured. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked at her. I placed the stack on the table in front of her. "The final copy, Serena, as you requested." She smiled, a victor's smile, meant for me alone. It was brimming with condescension, with pity. It was the smile of a predator that had finally, conclusively, cornered its prey. She didn't even glance at the text. Why would she? She was signing her masterpiece. Her eyes were on the Grayford Chronicle photographer, already posing for the shot that would be on tomorrow's front page. She tapped the top page, aligning it with the edge of the table. It was then that I heard it, from my father's seat, a sound that was not a word, but was louder than any shout. He coughed, a small, dry, sharp sound, and simultaneous with the cough, his hand, resting on the table near his water glass, moved, his cluster of keys, the heavy ring with the north line and fob, jingled. Not the two sharp jingles of record, just one, a single, short, metallic chink. It was not a command. It was a confirmation. It was the go order from my co-conspirator. It was the final, silent, I am with you before we went over the top. My spine stiffened. The last wisp of doubt I held about him, the last fear that he might, at the final second, betray me for the sake of his house, evaporated in the heat of the TV lights. I kept my hand on the snake plant. I drew my personal phone from my pocket, holding it below the level of the podium, shielded from the crowd. My thumb hovered over the screen. I had a single, pre-drafted email. The recipient list was 2 names, Alistair Finch, at Cedarline Forensics, and Marcus Thorne, the chairman of our audit committee. The subject line contained 2 words, keys ringing. My thumb pressed send. The email, the digital bullet, was in the air, traveling at the speed of light to the 2 men I had designated as the executioners. The first layer of the plan was now in motion, irreversible. Wait! The voice was sharp, panicked. It cut through the din. My heart didn't stop. It just hammered once, hard, against my ribs. I looked up. It was Harris, Serena's personal legal counsel. He was pushing through the crowd of photographers, his face pale and sweating. He was clutching a thick, blue-bound document to his chest. Her contract. The real one. "Serena, wait!" he shouted again, shouldering a cameraman aside. "That's not the right version. This is the countersigned copy from the partners." Serena's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted fury. This was not in her script. Harris was ruining her shot. "Harris, what on earth are you doing? Get back. You're making a scene." "No, you don't understand," he panted, finally reaching the edge of the table, his hand outstretched. "The one you have. I haven't reviewed it. You must sign this one." This was it, the moment of failure, the one variable I couldn't control, the physical intervention of a man paid to be paranoid. He was 3 feet from the table. He was about to grab the substitution rider and expose the entire plan. And then, just as I was calculating how to physically block him, his phone rang. It didn't buzz. It rang. A shrill, classical music ringtone that was as frantic as his expression. He froze, his hand in the air. He looked at the caller ID. His face went from pale to ashen. "I can't take this," he hissed at the phone, but he answered it anyway. "What? What?" He listened, his mouth falling open. He turned away from Serena, his back to the cameras. "How is that possible? I just came up in it." He listened again. "Both of them? Trapped between 30 and 31? But the override key is in my briefcase, and my briefcase is... It's in the elevator." I had to give my head of engineering a bonus, a massive one. His simulated simultaneous fault test on the executive elevator bank had been timed to the minute. I had asked him to run it at 10:05 a.m., and it was now 10:06. Harris, the only man in the building besides security who had the physical key to override the executive elevators, had, in his haste, left his briefcase in the very elevator he now needed to rescue. He was stranded. His precious, real contract was trapped in a steel box, and he was standing here, helpless. Get building security!" he shrieked into the phone. "I have to be." He looked back at Serena, his eyes wide with panic. He was a man trapped between 2 apocalypses, a multi-million-dollar contract about to be signed incorrectly, and a high-value executive, our CFO, as I had arranged, Trapped in an elevator, the immediate physical emergency won. "I have to go," he whispered to Serena. His voice choked. "There's an emergency. The elevators. Don't sign until I get back." And with that, he was gone, pushing his way back through the crowd, screaming into his phone about override protocols. The room was quiet for a beat, the press unsure what they had just witnessed. Serena, however, recovered instantly. She let out a small, theatrical, patronizing laugh. "Lawyers," she said, rolling her eyes at the FBN camera. "Always an emergency, right? They live for the drama." She tapped the paper in front of her. "Now, shall we make this official?" She picked up the Montlock pen. The cameras, sensing the climax, surged forward. The shutters began their machine gun chatter. She looked at my father. "Graham, a new era." My father nodded, his face an unreadable mask. "A new era, Serena." She clicked the pen. She unfurled her elegant, practiced signature onto the line at the bottom of the page. Serena Vale, chairwoman. The ink was dark, permanent. The cameras flashed, a blinding, non-stop strobe, capturing her triumphant smile, her eyes crinkled in victory, her hand holding the pen that had just signed her own execution. She had just personally attested to her own fraud. She had just armed the morals clause with the video of her own violence. She had just activated the trigger that would recall her escrow. And she had just, with a beautiful flowing S and a confident, looping V, handed me the keys to the entire United States auditing industry. I stood by the snake plant, my hand resting calmly on the pot. The button camera was rolling. The phone camera was rolling. The press cameras were rolling. She had never been more visible, and she had never been more trapped. The first layer of the plan, the secret one, was complete. Now, it was time for the second. The applause was a wave of manufactured sound, washing over Serena as she held the signed page aloft for the cameras. She was radiant, a queen accepting the adulation of her subjects. The flashes were a violent, blinding strobe, freezing her triumphant smile in 1,000 identical images. My father, his face an unreadable mask of granite, took the next page and added his own signature. A simple, unadorned G, Vale. The deal was done. The trap was set. Now, it was time to pull the wire. I stepped forward from the shadows by the snake plant, moving past Serena, who was already accepting a glass of champagne from an aide. I walked to the podium, the nexus of control for the room's audiovisuals. I picked up the microphone. The low-level hum of the crowd died down, all eyes turning to me. Serena's smile tightened. This was her moment, and I was stealing her light. "Thank you, Serena, Father," my voice said, and I was pleased to hear it come out perfectly calm, perfectly clear, amplified by the speakers to fill every corner of the atrium. A truly historic moment for Northline. Before we move to the Q&A and our partners sign, we have a brief, mandatory compliance statement to present. The phrase compliance statement was a beautiful anesthetic. It was so corporate, so boring, so utterly devoid of drama that the reporters collectively sighed. A few lowered their cameras. It bought me exactly the time I needed. Serena looked annoyed, tapping her fingernails on her champagne flute, irritated by the procedural delay. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out the small, antique-looking key my father had given me. The USB. I slotted it into the side of the laptop on the podium, the massive 80-inch screen behind the signing table, which had been displaying the West Briar, a New Era logo, flickered to black. The room, momentarily plunged into a strange digital twilight, held its breath. Then, the new image appeared. It was not a PowerPoint slide. It was the ceiling-down view of the 42nd floor conference room. I recognized the scene instantly. The charcoal carpet, the frosted glass walls, my own figure, sitting at the table, my father, his back partially to the camera, and Serena, standing. The audio was live, crisp and sterile. The first sound was the definitive click of the conference room door being shut by Serena's hand. The room was absolutely silent. Every person, every reporter, every board member was frozen, staring at the screen. On the screen, Serena's voice, cold and precise, filled the atrium. "You will not cause a scene. You will not ask questions. You will sign this deal." I saw myself on the screen, a younger, more beaten version of the woman at the podium, staring at the ceiling, and then I saw Serena, in her sharp white blazer from yesterday, lift the thick, bound contract. I saw her swing it. And then, the sound, the thud. It was not a slap. It was a heavy, sickening impact of bound paper against bone. It was the sound of violence, sanitized by a corporate setting, and it was utterly, undeniably real. A collective gasp, a physical intake of breath, sucked the air from the atrium. The camera flashes stopped. There was only the sound of the video. And then, her whisper, amplified to a shout by the PA system, "Sign it with your head down." The video file was set to loop. The click of the door, the swing, the thud, the whisper, again and again. It was a brutal, mesmerizing rhythm of abuse. I looked at Serena. She was no longer smiling. Her face was a mask of chalky white, her eyes wide, locked on the screen, seeing her private act of dominance replayed as a public spectacle. She was the first to break the silence. A laugh. It was a terrible sound, high-pitched, brittle, and shattering. What is this?" she stammered, turning to the crowd, her hands spread in a gesture of dismissive disbelief. This is absurd. This is a joke." She tried to rally, to find her footing on the collapsing ground. "It's a deepfake, a cheap, pathetic deepfake, obviously. Harper, this is truly desperate." The reporters were not laughing. They were not moving. Their cameras were all aimed at her. Their red recording lights a silent, judging chorus. They knew. They had heard the thud. "A deepfake, Serena?" I said, my voice still perfectly level, cutting through her panicked laughter. I walked from the podium to the signing table. I picked up the stack of papers she had just signed, the contract for her new era. I held it up. "This is your signature, isn't it? From just a moment ago?" She nodded, her eyes darting, cornered. "Please," I said, addressing the room, "direct your attention to the screen and to the document itself." With the mouse on the podium, I paused the video. I froze it on the frame just after the hit, the moment the contract lay on the conference room table. "I'm zooming in," I announced. I pushed the cursor, and the image magnified, focusing on the top right corner of the digital document shown in the video. There, faint but clear, was a string of microtext. As you can see, the digital watermark on the file at the time of the recording was KV031. Then, I held up the physical contract she had just signed. I held it close to the Chronicle reporter's camera. I pointed to the exact same spot on the paper. "And here it is, on the paper you are holding in your hand, printed from the very same file, KV031. I let the words hang in the air. The silence in the room was no longer just quiet. It was pressurized. It was the silence of a courtroom that had just heard the irrefutable proof. "This is not a deepfake, Serena," I said, my voice dropping. "This is a chain of custody. You didn't just assault me to force a signature. You assaulted me with the very document you just certified to this room, and this watermark proves it." I walked back to the podium. I was in complete control. I was just an operator, running a procedure. "And since you were in such a hurry," I continued, "you signed this document without reading it. Allow me to read the most important parts for you." The crowd was stone. My father hadn't moved. His face was like a death mask. I scrolled through the PDF version on the screen, the one I'd pulled from the USB. Let's turn to page 112, section 24, the Key Person Morals Clause. It states, "If any individual designated as a key person, that's you, Serena, you insisted on it, is found, through verifiable evidence, to have engaged in an act of physical violence or intimidation against another employee on company property, Northline Holdings' exclusive option to purchase the West Briar Logistics Park at the end of the lease term is immediately and irrevocably terminated. I looked up and made eye contact with her. This, I said, gesturing to the looping video of the thud, is the verifiable evidence you just cost our shareholders the entire $280 million ownership option. You've reduced our greatest asset to a very, very expensive rental property. A low groan came from the back of the room, where the board members were standing. Marcus Thorne, the audit chair, was watching me, his face grim, but he nodded. "But that's just the start," I said, my voice hardening. "Because the contract you signed also contained an escrow trigger. It's an automated function. It authorizes me, as COO, to submit this evidence of a material breach directly to the escrow agent." I toggled from the video file to my email client. The room watched as I attached the thud MP4 file to a new message. The recipient was a secure address at Halverton Trust, the bank holding our $10 million deposit. The clause states that upon submission of this proof, the entire deposit is to be immediately rerouted from your preferred unsupervised fund. I hit send and wired directly back to the Northline Holdings corporate treasury account. I switched the screen's input to a live feed of our company's primary cash account. The room stared at a list of numbers. We waited. 1 second, 2, the silence was absolute, and then, blink. A new line item appeared at the top of the screen. Incoming wire transfer. 10,000 house. Ref. WB escrow trigger breach 112. Your control over the capital is gone, I stated. Serena was shaking. Her hands were flat on the table, as if to hold herself up. She looked at my father, her eyes pleading. Graham, make her stop this. This is illegal." Before my father could answer, the main atrium doors swung open with a bang. It wasn't security. It was Alistair Finch. He looked exactly as I'd imagined. Tall, thin as a rail, in a suit that cost more than my car. He was flanked by 2 associates who looked like they had been genetically engineered to find rounding errors. He walked with a brisk, unhurried pace, past the stunned reporters, straight to the podium. He ignored Serena as if she were a piece of furniture. He addressed my father, but his voice was dry and clear, and he spoke directly into my microphone. "Mr. Vale," he announced, his British accent cutting through the stale air. "I am Alistair Finch of Cedarline Forensics. As of 10:08 a.m. this morning, my firm was formally engaged by the chairman of your audit committee, Mr. Marcus Thorne." He held up a signed letter. "Pursuant to the audit call option clause within the West Briar Master Lease, signed at approximately 10:07 a.m., the committee has voted unanimously to trigger an immediate, unrestricted, 24-hour forensic audit." He paused, letting the words land. Then he delivered the kill shot. "All executive accounts, budgets, and associated special purpose entities, specifically including, but not limited to, an LLC registered as Aldercrest Advisory, are now under forensic review. We have a team in your server room as we speak. Please instruct your staff not to interfere." That was the word. Not violence, not escrow, not morals clause. It was Aldercrest. The secret name, the name of her theft, the name of the shell company, the name that connected her to the offshore accounts and the 2% kickbacks. It was the name of the real crime, the one that meant prison. Serena Vale made a small sound, a tiny, strangled gasp. Her hand, the one that had held the pen, was still resting on the table. Her fingers, which had been clutching the edge, went lax. The Montlock pen, the heavy, gleaming black and platinum torpedo, her symbol of power and victory, slipped from her grasp. It didn't just drop. It fell in the suffocating silence, and the sound of it hitting the polished mahogany table, then skittering to the floor, was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the clack skitter of a crown falling. It was the sound of a judge's gavel. It was a single, perfect, metallic ring, echoing in the vast, silent room, signaling the end. The sound of the falling pens seemed to echo, a sharp, metallic punctuation mark that hung in the superheated, silent air. The looping thud of the assault video, which I had forgotten to turn off, was the only other sound, a grotesque heartbeat underscoring the tableau of her ruin. Then, a new presence made itself known. A chair scraped. Marcus Thorne, the chairman of the audit committee, rose from his front row seat. He was a man carved from old-world integrity, and his face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. He walked not to Serena, but to the podium, where I stood. He nodded at me, a gesture of profound, grim respect, and I stepped aside, yielding the floor. He took the microphone, his large, veined hand wrapping around it. His voice, when it came, was not the reedy tone of a 75-year-old. It was a booming, resonant instrument of final judgment. As chairman of the audit committee of Northline Realty Holdings, he began. His voice amplified, causing the reporters, who had been frozen, to scramble, their cameras and microphones suddenly swiveling to him. I am here to confirm the validity of the contract you have all just witnessed. He paused, letting the legal confirmation sink in. Pursuant to the covenants within that document, specifically Section 22.4c, the anti-kickback representation, which Ms. Vale has personally certified with her signature, and Section 31.2, the audit call option, the board has been presented with overwhelming and immediate evidence of gross fiduciary misconduct, self-dealing, and corporate fraud. Fraud. He said the word that moved this from a family drama to a federal crime. Therefore, by the power vested in this committee by the company's bylaws and by the very contract she has just signed, I declare that Ms. Serena Vale is hereby suspended from all duties, titles, and responsibilities as chairwoman and as an officer of this company, effective immediately, pending the unappealable results of the full forensic audit. Suspended, immediately, the legal guillotine had fallen. From the corners of the atrium, 2 uniformed building security officers, men I saw every day in the lobby, materialized. They were not aggressive. Their movements were polite, practiced, and utterly implacable. They moved toward Serena, who was still frozen, her hands on the table, her knuckles white. "Ma'am," the senior one said, his voice soft but firm, not touching her. "We need to ask you to come with us." The press exploded, but it was not a sound of shutters this time. It was the sound of a dozen laptops opening, of a furious, frantic clattering of keys. Headlines were being rewritten in real time. The story of a new era was dead. The story of Vale chairwoman ousted for fraud was being born, line by frantic line, on the glowing screens that illuminated the reporters' rapt, hungry faces. Serena's head snapped up. She looked past the guards, past the press, past me. Her eyes found my father, who was still standing in the center of the stage, paralyzed. He was the statue of the founder, a man of bronze, immobilized by the history he had allowed to happen. "Graham," she breathed, her voice a raw plea. "Graham, tell them, stop this, make them stop this, Graham." It was the final test. The house was burning, and she was on one side, and we were on the other. He had to choose. My father looked at her. His face was a landscape of grief, a decade of compromise and cowardice warring with the finality of this moment. He saw the woman he had loved, or at least the woman he had chosen, and he saw the abyss she had created. He took a half step toward her, an instinctive motion of comfort. And then he stopped. His hand, which had started to lift, fell back to his side. He looked at his hand, the one that had held the keys, the one that had built this company, and he left it there, empty. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just stood, silent, and let it happen. His silence was the loudest sound in the room. It was his final, public abdication of her, and his first, final alignment with the truth. Serena saw it. She saw the refusal, the love, or whatever it was, had been rescinded. The choice was made. And in that instant, her shock shattered, and what lay beneath was a core of pure, unadulterated rage. "No," she whispered. The guards took her arms. "Ma'am, please." "No!" She ripped her arm away. "You can't touch me!" She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me as I stood by the podium. "Her! It was her! She did this! That little bitch! She planned all of this!" I had not turned off the microphone. It was a high-quality, directional mic, and I had left it live. Her shriek, her accusation, her confession, boomed across the atrium. It was picked up by every television camera, every audio recorder. That little bitch. She planned all of this. It was a public record, her final, unintended testimony. She was confirming her own motive, confirming the animosity that the video had so clearly shown. She had just, in effect, confessed to the world. Ding. The sound was impossibly clean. Cutting through her scream, the elevator doors, the ones Harris had been so concerned about, slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The emergency was over. The trap was open. The guards, seizing the moment of her distraction, took her firmly by the elbows. They were not polite anymore. They were efficient. They propelled her across the remaining 20 feet of marble floor, her heels skittering, her fight dissolving into panicked sobs. "Get your hands off me! Do you know who I am? Graham?" They reached the elevator. The doors were mirrored, polished stainless steel. For a fraction of a second, before they pushed her inside, I saw her. I saw her reflection. It was not the poised, perfect chairwoman in her white suit. It was a distorted, warped image of a woman, her face twisted in a mask of primal fury and terror, her body seeming to melt and bend in the convex steel. It was the truth of her, reflected back at her at the very end. She disappeared into the mirrored surface. The doors slid shut, the two panels of steel meeting with a soft, final click. She was gone. The atrium was a vacuum. The press was silent, stunned. The board members were pale. My father looked like he had aged 20 years. Then, a new sound, a low, incessant vibration. I looked down. In my hand, my personal cell phone was buzzing, the screen illuminating. I had been clutching it ever since I sent the keys-ringing email. I looked at the caller ID. It was not a name. It was an acronym, SEC. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the market regulators. My email to Marcus had, as required by law, been auto-forwarded to our corporate compliance officer and to the SEC's whistleblower hotline. I turned away from the crowd and answered the call, my voice low. But the microphone was still live, and it caught every word. "This is Harper Vale." I listened. The voice on the other end was calm, federal, and to the point. "Yes, I understand," I said. "Yes, the allegations are true. Yes, I have the complete documentation, the server audit, the wire transfer history, the video files, and the original emails. Yes, I am available to meet this afternoon. I am ready." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The show was over. The legal reality was beginning. I looked up, over the heads of the stunned reporters, over the signing table with its fallen pen and scattered champagne glasses. I looked at the massive, brushed steel logo on the wall behind the podium. Northline, the N. The hot white television lights were still blazing, focused on the stage. The silver N seemed to glow, to burn with a clean, intense brightness I had never seen before. It looked sharper, as if years of tarnish and grime had been sandblasted off in an instant, leaving only the pure, strong metal beneath. Or maybe, I thought, it was not the logo. Maybe it was just me. Maybe the suffocating 2-ton pressure I had been carrying in my chest for a decade. The weight of the lies, the secrets, the unheard screams, the silent keys. Maybe it had all just been released. I took a deep breath. The air in the atrium was hot and stale, but it felt like the first clean, pure lungful of oxygen I had taken in my entire adult life. I could finally breathe. The looping video file was still playing on the 80-inch screen, a grotesque, silent movie repetition of the assault. As the audio had been cut when Marcus Thorne took the microphone, the thud was gone, but the image of the blow, the recoil, the sneer, the whisper played on. It was the first thing I did when I stepped back to the podium. I closed the media player. The screen went black. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier than any sound. It was the sound of a vacuum, of 150 people holding their breath, collectively processing the corporate execution they had just witnessed. The heat from the television lights felt oppressive, a physical weight on my shoulders. The air smelled of burnt coffee, expensive perfume, and the new sharp odor of mass panic. Then, a single sound, the clap of two hands coming together. It was not from the press gallery. They were a frantic mass of clattering keyboards and whispered, urgent phone calls to their editors. It was Marcus Thorne. He was still standing, his duty done, and he was looking at me. He clapped once, then twice. It was a slow, deliberate, powerful sound. It was not applause. It was an endorsement. A second person joined him, a woman from the board I barely knew, who had always looked at me with a sort of polite indifference. Her hands met, then another, and another. It was not a standing ovation. It was not the thunderous, fake applause from the beginning of the press conference. It was a sporadic, ragged, deeply human sound. It was the sound of a fever breaking, of a spell being shattered. It was the sound of a board of directors realizing they had just been saved from their own catastrophic negligence. I stepped away from the podium, my legs feeling strangely light, as if they were not quite connected to the floor. My adrenaline was a high, thin wire of sound in my ears. The press corps surged, a wave of bodies and black camera lenses, but they were held back by the new, grim-faced security detail that had materialized at the edges of the stage. They shouted questions, a wall of noise I didn't bother to parse. "Ms. Vale, what did the SEC say? When did you know? Is your father involved?" I ignored them all. I walked toward the edge of the atrium, where the Northline employees had been gathered, a captive audience for Serena's triumph. They were still there, lining the wide corridor that led back to the main office, a long gauntlet of familiar faces. They weren't clapping, they were just watching me. Their faces were a catalog of reactions: shock, fear, disbelief. But as I drew closer, I saw other things. I saw the project manager, a brilliant woman in her late 40s, the one Serena had told. "That face just doesn't project authority." The woman's eyes met mine, and her hand, which had been covering her mouth, slowly lowered. She nodded at me, a single, sharp dip of her chin. It was a salute. I saw the young analyst, a recent graduate, who I had seen crying in the stairwell 2 months ago after Serena had publicly shredded her financial model in a team meeting, calling her a child playing with numbers. The analyst was standing with her friends, and her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a dawning, ferocious light. They parted as I approached, creating a path. No one touched me, no one spoke, but as I walked through their ranks, I felt it, the shift, the silent, tectonic movement of power. The fear that had slicked these marble floors for years was evaporating, rising like steam. It was being replaced by something else, something I had not felt in this building since my father taught me how to read definitions in his dusty, long-ago office. It felt like respect. I reached the end of the gauntlet and turned, looking back at the stage. It was a wreck, a scene of beautiful, calculated destruction. The banner was askew. The table was littered with abandoned glasses. The fallen Montlock pens still lay on the floor, a gleaming black casualty. And my father was walking toward me. He moved like a man in a dream, stepping around the debris. He was no longer the impassive bronze statue. He was just Graham Vale, a man in a very expensive suit who had just watched his life burn down on live television. He had to navigate the mess, the physical evidence of the lie he had cohabited with for a decade. He walked past the podium. He walked past the dark, silent screen. He walked past Marcus Thorne, who gave him a look of complex, pitying respect. He finally stopped, standing directly in front of me. We were the same height. His eyes, which had avoided mine for a year, met them directly. They were clear. The conflict was gone. The fear was gone. There was just a profound, bottomless sadness, and beneath it, the bedrock of the man I remembered, the builder. He said nothing. He simply reached into his pocket, the one he always used. He pulled out the heavy cluster of keys, the keys that had jingled for safety, the keys that had jinged for record, the keys that had been our secret, desperate language of survival. The heavy silver fob with the north line end glittered under the harsh lights. He held them out to me, his hand steady. He placed the keyring in my open, waiting palm. He did not let them jingle. They made no sound. The transfer was silent, absolute. "From now on," he said, his voice quiet, rough, and for my ears only, "you don't need signals." I closed my fingers around the metal. The keys were cold, a dense, metallic weight, but my hand, I realized, was hot, burning with adrenaline and the release of a 10-year-old suppressed rage. The cold metal against my hot palm was a shock, a grounding. I felt the sharp, milled edges of the individual keys, the keys to the offices, the server rooms, the executive suites, the entire physical structure of the company. I felt the weight of the fob, the symbol of the brand. Signals are for prisoners, I thought, for people trapped in basements, tapping on pipes, for people in hostage situations, for children and their fathers, living in a house with a monster. He was right. I didn't need them anymore. The door was open. The monster was gone. I held them, the metal already warming to my skin, becoming a part of me. I looked down, past the keys, to the signing table. The contract was still there. My substitution rider, the ghost in the machine. Serena's magnificent, defiant signature was drying on the page. I looked at that signature, and I thought of the words she had unknowingly certified. The anti-kickback representation, my legal bear trap, which had just sprung. The morals clause, my personal shield, which had just held. The audit call option, my key to the truth, which Alistair Finch was at this very moment using to rip her secret kingdom apart. These were the new definitions. My father had taught me to read them, and I had finally written my own. They were clauses that protected the company not from outside forces, but from itself, from its own leaders. They were lines of code that protected the analysts in the stairwells, the project managers in the meetings, the thousands of people who would work in the warehouses and offices of West Briar, people who would never know that their right to a safe, non-violent, non-fraudulent workplace had been signed into existence on this chaotic, disastrous, victorious morning. I realized the microphone at the podium was still live. The reporters were still waiting, their cameras still pointed, their microphones still extended, a forest of black foam and steel. They had the what. Now they wanted the why. They wanted the soundbite that would explain the new world. I walked back to the podium, my father stepping aside to let me pass. I clutched the keys in my hand. I stood before the cameras, before the board, before my employees, before the entire city. I was not the COO. I was not the victim on the video. I was the founder's daughter, and I had just taken back my house. I leaned into the microphone. "We are locking away the mistakes," I said, my voice ringing with a final, absolute clarity. "And we are opening the door to what's right." The words hung in the air. I let them. I saw the press digest them, saw them realize this was the new brand. This was the new mission. We were locking away the shadows, the backroom deals, the kickbacks, the whispers, the violence, the Aldercrest advisory accounts, the fear, and we were opening the door to the auditors, to the SEC, to the light, to the truth. A single flashbulb popped, a brilliant, blinding white explosion of light. In that fraction of a second, the world was reduced to a stark, high contrast image, the atrium, the stunned faces, the dark screen. All of it vanished. The only thing I saw, the only thing I felt, was the after image burned onto my retinas, the freeze frame of the new era, my own hand, clenching the keys so tightly my knuckles were white. The keys were ours. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know your thoughts. So please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from so we can connect. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And if you really want to support the story, please hit that hype button. It helps more than you know and gets this story heard by so many more people.